Hi.
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 These are my colleagues, Bojan and Jadranka.
Hello, I'm Jadranka. I'm a teacher of humanities and social sciences and a librarian too. I'm really thrilled of your visit in our Zoom meeting. Thank you very much. And this is Bojan.
Thank you for having me. I'm Bojan Bebic. I'm a teacher of history and a teacher of computer science. And we are very pleased to welcome you to our medical school, Varaždin. I hope you will have a good time along with us. Thank you. And now...
This is Josip,
yes.
and he will tell you something about our country, our school, and competition in which they read your book.
Okay, good morning. I'm Josip Padala, and I am a second grade student in medical high school in Varaždin. That is an average city in the north of Croatia. So, have you ever heard about Croatia, or maybe do you know where Croatia is?
On a map, I do. I've never been to Croatia, but yeah, I'd love to hear whatever you want to share about your country.
Okay, so I hope that this interview might encourage you to find out more about this small but very beautiful and exquisite country. And maybe one day you decide to come to visit us. Anyway, we are glad that you found time and decided to be part of this interview. So we hope it will be interesting and exciting for you and that you will enjoy answering the questions. This school year, a few of us have participated in the competition called Mreža čitanja, or Reading Network in English, which goal is to persuade young people from Croatia to read more and to develop a critical opinion about what they have read. This year's topic was about bookshops and how can just an ordinary bookshop change lives and turn them upside down. One of 3 books that we needed to prepare for national competition was your first released book, Bookshop of Yesterdays, or translated into Croatian, Nebo puno knjiga. In the competition, there were many questions about the author, the author's accomplishments, and about the book itself. This is our favorite book, so in agreement with our mentors, we decided to find out something more about you and this marvelous novel. So, first of all, I would like to know a bit more about you. So, could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us what was the idea behind this novel?
Sure. Well, first, again, thank you for having me. This is a first for me, and I'm really honored. Yeah, so I started the Bookshop of Yesterdays when I was in graduate school for creative writing. And it started actually with a newspaper article that I read. It was an essay in the New York Times, which is one of the biggest newspapers in the US. And the author of this essay wrote about the strange things people have found in books. Everything from teeth that someone discarded to one used bookseller found $40,000. Somebody else found a piece of bacon, which is kind of disgusting. But so this essay really charmed me because it made me realize that you can tell a lot about people based on the things that they leave behind in books. And so I just was thinking on that for a while, and it made me wonder about what if somebody left something intentionally in books. And so the idea kind of started there with leaving things behind in books for someone to discover later. After that, I kind of found the setting of the bookshop. But at the time I didn't know, at least in the US, and it sounds like in Croatia too, that books set in bookstores are very popular. It's kind of a subgenre of its own. So I sort of fell into that, and then since have discovered that it is sort of entering this like community of books and writers who write about bookstores. And it makes sense to me because, you know, it's a big part of the reading community is bookstores. And so in response, I've just gotten to meet a lot of people who work in bookshops and to really appreciate the community around bookstores. So that was a lot of what I wanted to create in my novel. In terms of me, I grew up in Philadelphia, which is on the East Coast of the US, and I now live in Los Angeles, which is about as far as you can get from where I grew up. I moved out here for, as I was saying before, for graduate school at the University of Southern California, where I still teach. I teach undergraduates, I teach them essay writing and critical thinking. So I really like teaching. I think teaching is an important part of writing because when you tell someone else, when you give someone else guidance, you sort of have to follow it yourself. So teaching writing really kind of reaffirms for me the important aspects of it. I guess, you know, I've always known that I wanted to be a writer. I started writing when I was little, and this novel took me about 8 years to write. My second novel was a little bit quicker than that, but I really learned how to write through this book. So yeah, it was a long journey, and it still is surreal to me that it's published and that it's published in other parts of the world, and that people like all of you are reading it.
We all agree that your book is quite interesting and a little bit different from the others. The bookshops of yesterday's left us delighted and surprised. We all like the parts with the puzzles, and they show in a great way the unbreakable bond between a father and a daughter, even though they were separate for many years. The book is great, and we would recommend it. It is definitely worth reading it. It will leave you moved and probably with a few tears in your eyes. So, do you personally like solving puzzles?
Oh yeah, I was saying that we used in elementary school, we used to have these logic puzzles that we would do, where they'd be something like, you know, if Jane is 5 feet tall and she's 4 inches shorter than Joe, and then you have to work backwards and figure out like how tall everyone is. And I used to make those up and try to stump my teacher. So I've always loved those kinds of puzzles. And then I've also always really loved riddles. So I just sort of, you know, got inspired by that. And one of the things I did while I was writing the novel was when I would come up with a clue, I have one friend who's really, really good at solving riddles. So I would send them to her, and if she answered them too quickly, then I knew I had to make them a little harder. But I'm not sure I left off. What I was saying is, so I had this friend who I used I would, you know, bounce my riddles off of her to make sure that they were challenging without being too hard. I think one of the things I discovered in writing this novel, and one of the things that was fun about it, is that it gets to celebrate not only my love of reading, but readers' love of reading too. And so the whole point of the clues is to bring readers in and to see if they can solve them too. So if they were too difficult, then that kind of loses some of the fun for the readers. But yeah, I mean, I've always loved scavenger hunts and riddles, and so it was really fun to get to put them into a book.
And how did you choose the books that you included in Miranda's scavenger hunt?
So that was one of the biggest challenges of writing this book, was figuring out what novels to include. And it's been really interesting watching the book be published in other countries that have other literary traditions, and knowing or not knowing. I tried to pick books that are fairly well known, but I was definitely coming from a you know, perspective of what's well known here. So it's been interesting to see what you know, students like yourselves, people in other places, the books that are familiar and are not. But basically what I did was the books were really helpful in creating a structure for the story. So I don't traditionally outline, but I did use the novels to create an outline. So I knew before I started writing kind of what each clue had to accomplish in terms of Miranda learning the story of the past. But the thing is, the story of the past changed a few times while I was writing. So in earlier versions, Billy's history was very different than it ended up being in the novel that published. And in response to that, I had to keep changing what books I used, because the novels that I selected, I wanted them to do a few things. I wanted them to have a section that I could quote. I wanted something about the plot to go along or resonate with the stories that Miranda was being told. So they had to have a lot of significance in her life. They had to have something that I could pull out and put on the page that could sort of serve as Billy talking to her through the novel. And then I also wanted them to be novels that readers might know and love. So what I did is, for every clue, I made a list of 5 books, most of which I've read, but some I hadn't read. I made a list of 5 books and that I thought might fit. And then I revisited those books or read them again read them for the first time to figure out which one seemed like the right fit for the novel. But the thing is, when I changed part of the story and I had to change the book, I had to go through that process again of picking a new novel. So on one hand, it helped give structure to the book, and it helped, one of the things about writing a novel is it's so long, you can't tackle it all at once. You have to kind of figure out ways to break it up to make the task easier, sort of small goals along the line of something bigger. So the books were, picking those novels was really helpful for that, but it was a ton of work to figure out which one was right. And it was also very difficult and interesting to think about, I wanted to pick novels that hopefully people knew and loved, not necessarily because they read them in school, but because they were something, that they read on their own time. And it's hard, at least thinking about here, it's think of what novels are kind of below. So I actually talked to my students and asked them for help, not in terms of picking the books, but in terms of what they think is sort of a shared common reading experience, in terms of what makes a book something that lots of people know and love. And those were really helpful conversations that helped kind of shape how I thought about the books that I chose.
Does Shakespeare and The Tempest have some special meaning for you?
Yeah, so that was one of the interesting things I don't know, do you read Shakespeare in school in Croatia?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things I learned that was interesting is that in Germany, Shakespeare is not very popular. So when my book came out in German, they had to tweak some stuff because, here we read lots of Shakespeare. It sounds like in Croatia they do too, certainly in England. But that's what I mean, that it's one of those maybe shared experiences that isn't kind of shared universally. But I picked The Tempest. That was very early on. I knew I wanted to name the character Miranda, and then from there, I immediately thought of The Tempest, which is my favorite Shakespeare play. I've seen it performed a bunch of times, and I think Shakespeare in general is, if you have the opportunity to see it live, The Tempest in particular is a really, really fun play to see live. So I just, at first when I picked The Tempest, I picked it pretty simply because it was a story of a father telling his daughter about, the past and what happened to break apart their family. But then as I was rereading it, and as I was reading some, theoretical essays about it by Shakespeare experts, I remembered that the play is, on the surface, it seems like it's about revenge. And I talk about this in the novel, but it's really about forgiveness. And it's about finding forgiveness without having to get an apology. So it's kind of, allowing yourself to forgive rather than to you. And I thought that worked really well with the spirit of my novel. So one of the things that I've discovered as a writer is that you have to make choices as a writer. And the choices you make, you think you're making them for one reason, but then later you realize that there's another reason. So it's sort of this kind of luck or serendipity of writing where things end up having deeper meaning than you intend them to. And that certainly happened with me with The Tempest.
We read that you published your second novel, The Imperfects, which is about the Florentine diamond, and it certainly took a lot of research on that. So, which novel was harder to write, and how long does it take you to write the second novel?
Yeah. Well, my first novel definitely took longer to write, but I'm not sure that's because it was a harder book to write. I think every book is different. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things a mentor of mine told me is that every novel you're reinventing the wheel. So you sort of have to start over and learn the process again. So my second novel had a lot of research in it, and I honestly hope it's coming out in Croatian. But it was a lot of history about gemology and gemstones and diamonds, and the history of crown jewels. The Florentine diamond that the novel's based on was part of the Austrian crown jewels. There was also a lot of, I had to do a lot of history or research, I should say, about immigration to the US during the Holocaust and World War II. So and also about World War I as well, and the fall of the Habsburg Empire. So in some ways that's very, very time consuming, but kind of like I was saying with the books that helped create a structure, one of the nice things about doing research for a novel is that it gives you plot points or story points. So it gives you things to write about that you don't have to wholly invent. So in a lot of ways, that novel was more work because it was a tremendous amount of research, but it also was swifter because as soon as I found the points in history I wanted to write about, it was a lot easier to just start writing. So I think, and it's interesting because I'm working on my third novel now, which doesn't really have any research. And I think it maybe is the hardest to write because everything has to come from my imagination, which probably sounds like it would be easier, but I'm finding it's harder. So, I think it's the other difference is that once you have a publisher, you are on deadlines. So part of why the bookshop of yesterdays took a lot longer to write was because I didn't have a deadline. I didn't have anyone waiting for it for the first 5 years that I was working on it. But once you're kind of in the system of publishing and there's the expectation that you publish regularly, you have to finish on time. So that definitely makes books not necessarily easier, but definitely faster to write.
Are there any real situations or events from the past described in the book, The Bookshop of Yesterdays,
that are true to me? I'm trying to think. Well, so I've always been really interested in estrangements, because my family is marked by one. Stop talking, and I never of extended family outside my parents and brother. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that my mom told me the story of what happened between her and her father and why they stopped talking, which is not anything like The Bookshop of Yesterdays, our family history until I was older. And that's also a theme kind of in my second novel too, is, how we differentiate sort of our own personal history from a national history or a world history. And so I think I put a lot of that into Miranda, into realizing that, in part, her mother never encouraged her to ask questions, but she also wasn't really interested in her family's history and her own history until it was too late. And so that kind of stemmed from my family. And also, you know, I was, estrangements seem to be because people can't get along, but I think from my own family and from other people I know who've had family that have stopped talking, it often comes more from a miscommunication and from love than it does from sort of hate or something like that. So I really wanted to explore, you know, based on my own experience, the way it affects a family. Other than that, a lot of the locations in the novel are based on the area that I live now in Los Angeles, and also where Miranda teaches in Philadelphia is sort of based on where I grew up. But I don't really write autobiographical fiction. Certainly the characters are, I tend to combine people I know. So it's not like one character is one person, but that they're a combination of a couple of different people. So in that regard, there's a lot of people from my life in the novel, but there's nothing in it that's really a straight truth from my own life.
When and how did you first realize that you wanted to be a writer? Who inspired you?
To be perfectly honest, I was a little later to loving reading than I was to loving writing, which is, I don't know, I think is backwards. But when I was really little, I used to love to write stories that, looking back on them, didn't really make very much sense. But I have some of my earliest memories, once I learned how to read, was sitting on my parents in their bedroom on the floor and writing on their typewriter when I was a kid. And I just, I've always loved stories, but it wasn't really until high school that I really started to love to read on my own. I read a lot as a kid, but then I kind of fell out of it. And so, I don't know, I love a lot. I guess that's another part of the book that's, true. I put in a lot of novels that I love. I love Jane Eyre. That's one of my favorites. When I was in high school, I'd say like early things that inspired me were, I used to like things like Kurt Vonnegut. I'm not sure if he's published in Croatia. And I'm trying to think. I loved like Alice Walker. I just started to, I think what happened was, I started to love to read when I started to read really, really good stories. And so I think that's one of the things I think about a lot as a writer is what pulls me in, because there's different things that pull, that, make people want to turn the page, make people want to read. And for me, it's really about getting lost in a story. And so once I found else that's going on in your life, that's when I really became passionate about reading and committed more seriously to writing. But so since I was little, I've always wanted to write. I think sometimes when you're younger, you think if you like to read, you have to like everything you like to read. And that when people say that they don't like to read, it's just because they haven't found the books that they love yet, that speak to them. And so it took me, I guess, longer than I would have expected to find a lot of books that I really loved. And what I was saying before is that I realized that what makes me love a book is getting lost in the story, a story that makes you forget everything else that's going on in your life. And then I was saying that, I really started to write seriously when I was in college. I took creative writing classes. And then when I graduated college, I moved to New York and worked in publishing for a few years, which was really, really helpful. I think there are a lot of reasons to write, but if you want to write to publish, it's a really good idea to learn about the industry, because it's a business. And for me, that was really, really helpful to see the business side of it, both to understand now what happens when I, send my book to my editor and the process of it being published. But it's also important to remember that, that it is a business. And so because of that, if you want to publish, you have to think about your readers, and you have to think about what people want to read. Which I think is easy on one hand, when you're writing, you sort of have to forget about that in order to put words on the page. But as soon as you want someone else to read what you're writing, you have to think about what will interest them, what will keep them hooked, what they want to see on the page. So a big part of becoming a writer for me was kind of learning about that whole side of the industry too.
Can you name your favorite author and some of your favorite books?
I said, I think my all-time favorite author is Margaret Atwood. Is she published in Croatia? I think her most famous book is The Handmaid's Tale. There's like a TV show of it right now. So I love her writing. I'm trying to think of my bookshelf. Who do I love? For some reason, I always freeze when people ask me what my favorite books are. You know, I read a lot of contemporary fiction. I love people like Jennifer Egan, who writes all sorts of books. I like mysteries a lot. Lately, I've been reading a lot since the pandemic. I've been reading a lot of like literary thrillers, which are really fun. Yeah, I like things all sorts of books.
So some of our questions in our quiz were about where you live and what you did for a living and things like that. And we found out that you currently teach writing, and we don't really have that in here. So can you tell us more about what creative writing is? And
Sure. Usually if you take a creative writing class, it's called, the structure is what's called a workshop. So in a workshop, a student will bring in or will email to the class a short story or 15 pages of a novel. And then everyone will read it, and you'll come together for class and talk about the piece. You'll talk about what you thought was working, what you liked in it, and questions you had, things that don't make sense or things that for whatever reason didn't feel right to you as a reader. So it's a pretty intense experience because you have to sit in a room silently while your peers talk about your work and give you constructive criticism. Constructive criticism is really important because it's feedback on what you could do better in your work, but it's the point of it is to be encouraging. So usually that's most of what creative writing classes are. Usually you'll also read some published work and talk about it, but you talk about it in a way that's different than you would in a literature class. You talk about it in terms of how the story is put together. So, you know, you talk about plot, you talk about how characters are developed, you talk about language. So it's less looking at it as a reader as it is looking at it as a writer. And I think that's a really important part of being a writer, is learning how to read like a writer, which is different than reading like a reader. So it's still for enjoyment, but it's to see how a book is put together or a story is put together so that you can learn from it. So that's basically what creative writing classes and a degree in creative writing is just a series of these workshop classes that you take. So it's a different kind of learning, and the teacher's job is more to guide the discussion than to lecture. And so what happens with that is, you know, you want to make sure that the whole point of it is to be encouraging. So sometimes it can be a challenge as a teacher to make sure that everyone is being positive, because sometimes when we don't, sometimes we say things differently than we mean. And usually people are very sensitive about their writing because it's something that you don't share with other people that often. And it's scary to share it. Even publishing is scary to, you know, to put your words and your ideas out to other people. So yeah, most creative writing programs are graduate, so it's after university. They're usually 2 to 3 years. I actually teach nonfiction writing classes. So I teach essay classes where students, we still do those workshops where we all talk about each other's writing, but the students write about experiences from their own lives, or they write research that they do. But it's, you know, all of my students, the first time they have to workshop, are really nervous. And then afterwards, they usually tell me that they were pleasantly surprised at.
Can you tell us something about young people's reading interest and habits in America? Like, do they love to read, or do they despise it? And what books do high school students in America have to read?
Well, I think, and I'm interested to know if it's the same in Croatia, people always say no one reads anymore, which isn't true. Lots of people read. But during the pandemic, when everyone was home, people in America at least were reading a lot more than they did before. I don't know if you found that was true also in Croatia. Or were people reading more?
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So that's been great for publishing as an industry, that so many people were reading. In America, people tend to read the really big, like the very popular books, you know, John Grisham, or these like huge books that get made into movies are the most popular. In terms of high schoolers, I don't know what high schoolers read now, but I assume that there's a lot of classics that they read. There's, you know, in America, our education, particularly in literature, tends to be very American and Eurocentric. So I think there's been a push to read things outside of what's called the canon. So sort of the classic, you know, 18th and 19th century British and American novels, to read more from other parts of the world. So I'm not exactly sure what they read in high school now, but I think that there's a greater push in the curriculum to be more inclusive. But certainly you read a lot of Shakespeare. And then there are, you know, American classics like The Scarlet Letter, Moby Dick, things like that pretty much everyone reads. Yeah.
Do you have similar competitions in America to encourage reading among young people?
One of my jobs after college was I worked for the libraries in the US. I worked specifically with California, but I helped run this contest that was called Letters About Literature. And so what it was is that students from kindergarten through high school would write a letter to an author or I guess not kindergarten, probably third grade, would write a letter to an author who inspired them. So it wasn't the same as, it sounds like your contest where everybody read the same books. Everyone could write to a different author. And what I really liked about being part of that contest, so my job was to oversee the judging. I would also, any students who, I only covered the California entries. So there was usually a couple hundred every year. And I would oversee the judging of them, but I also would send the letters to any of the authors that were still alive. So some students would write, you know, might write to Shakespeare, who obviously I couldn't send the letter to, but a lot of them wrote to authors that were still alive. And sometimes the authors would write back to the students. What I really liked about that contest was it wasn't sort of your traditional which letter was the best written. What we were judging was which student had the most sincere and effective response to a book. So it enabled students, so it was about the students would write about their response to an author's work. So the students who won weren't always the same students who got the best grades in school, the most, how were the judges affected? And I used to judge the contest too. How are the judges affected by the letters that they read? So it was a really nice way of to get recognition for their love of reading. So that's the closest I know. I'm sure there's other, you know, the US is so big, I think a lot of those kinds of competitions are statewide as opposed to across the whole country. But that contest in particular is something that every state does, and it's a really nice way to encourage students to read and to love reading.
Did you expect your novel, The Bookshop of Yesterdays, to become so famous all around the world?
No, I never thought it was going to get published. So, you know, it's been really, really exciting and really surprising. I'm still in disbelief that anyone besides maybe my parents have read it. It's been really, really fun. And yeah, I think it's something you can't plan for, both publishing and people responding to your book. I also love that. That's one of my favorite covers. The Croatian one.
How did you feel when our teacher asked you for this meeting, and have you ever had similar meetings with students abroad?
I was so touched. This is really surreal for me to get to talk to all of you. And the fact, I can't believe my book was chosen as part of a contest. I mean, that's, yeah, that's really unbelievable. I would say the only somewhat similar things, I went back to my high school in Philadelphia and talked to a class of students who all read the book. But I haven't gotten to, you know, I think at least here, the way that my book was published, it was mostly older people who read it. So I haven't gotten to talk to that many groups of younger people. And I was very surprised and honored when I got the email from your teacher about this. Yeah, it's thing, you know, it's surprising what's like the most exciting and touching as a writer, and definitely things like this, like getting to talk to groups of students and people who love my book is always surprising and really amazing.
So how will you direct your child to be a reader and not just a consumer of digital content?
Oh, you know, well, so yeah, so my son is 19 months. So he's not reading on his own yet. But it's something that my husband and I talk about a lot, because he's also a writer. You know, how do we, you can't force someone. And I think if you try, like when I was a kid, my mom used to play the piano. So she forced me to play the piano. So I never liked it, you know? So I don't think you can force kids to do something or they won't enjoy it. So we talk a lot about how do we inspire him to be a reader. And actually my son's first word was book, which was really exciting. I think most kids, like the B sound, the B is pretty easy for them. So a lot of kids, their first word has that B sound. But, you know, I think as a writer, everyone who buys presents for my son, because I'm a writer, they always get him books. So I think that's a big part of it, is that he has so many books, and it's very interesting to watch what kids respond to, because there are certain things that they kind of universally like. And there are these classic children's books that I remember loving when I was little that he now loves. You know, most of the books that we read, it's just about looking at pictures and, you know, finding animals that he recognizes, adding colors and things like that. But I think that that's a start. And, you know, books right now are more objects than they are stories. So he flips through them. But I think just having a lot of books around hopefully is a way, you know, we also don't set rules. We let him watch some TV. And I think that helps, because as soon as something, kind of like if you force a kid, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. But I think just like you can't force a kid to like something, if you make it off limits, they're going to want to do it. So we let him watch, I mean, he's little, but we let him watch a little bit of TV. So I think it's, you know, I think it's just a combination of trying to inspire them, but also you have to let people find their own interests. So hopefully he'll be a reader, but that's kind of, you know, all I can do is give him stories that I think are great, and hopefully he'll respond to them. But I think contests like this one are really good for inspiring, you know, students to read.
Part of the reading network competition was to make short videos about 3 novels the students were supposed to read. And our Ivana Vrščak won the first place at the national level. She will tell you now more about it, and we will send you this video later. Ivana, can you please?
Yes, so I got the idea from the teacher to use the sketch note technique to retell the stories. So yeah, I did that, but yeah, it was kind of challenging because a little short of time. But yeah, given the hard work that we put in, we were really, really happy, especially me, that all the success that we achieved.
What books would you recommend to high school students who like your book to read that are similar to yours or something?
Well, there's so many books that are set in bookstores. So some that I really like. Actually, the book it's nothing like mine, but the first book I read set in a bookstore that really inspired me was by Murakami, who's a Japanese author, and it was called Norwegian Wood. And so that one's great. There's a book called Midnight in the Bright Ideas Bookstore. That is a really good bookstore book. There is, what's some of my other favorite ones? There's a book called The Storied Life of A.J. Furke, which is also another book set in bookstores. Some other books that I love that are about books and reading. There's a book called The History of Love by Nicole Krauss. There was a book that came out this year that was very popular in the US called Writers and Lovers by Lily King. I'll keep thinking, but yeah, I think, you know, for me, I always really like books that are about books and are about stories and bookshops, and there's so many of them. There's Shadows of the Wind is a really good bookstore book. There's so many of them.
All right, that will be all of us. Thank you very much for answering all of our questions and taking up some of your time for us. It means a lot of us, and we are really appreciated. And we are hoping to get more translations of your future books, and we wish you the best of luck in your future career.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, this has been a great
honor for all of us.
Yes, great honor and a great experience. And okay, I think you can hear me now. I see me now. And this is the first time we had something like this, and it was really, really interesting. And I think you liked it, I guess.
Yeah. Yes.
So, well, this was the first time, but we hope not the last time.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And maybe one day we'll use Croatia, so remember.
I would love to.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.